Picture this. A dining room in Grosvenor Square, 42 people at a table laid for 42, the candles doubled in the mirrors, and at the head of it a duke who has arranged the entire evening as a joke. The joke is his wife. She has been sent for from the country like a parcel, seated where the draught comes in, and the woman on his right, in his mother's emeralds, has already twice explained to the table that the Duchess of Ashmere does not go into society because she is not quite equal to it. The Duchess has said nothing for an hour and a quarter. And then the doors open for the last guest, and the servant announces the ambassador of his most faithful majesty, and the whole room rises the half-inch that a room rises for an ambassador, and the Conde de Vimero comes in and stops. He does not look at the Duke. He does not look at the woman in the emeralds. He crosses 11 feet of Turkey carpet in front of 42 people, and he stops in front of the plain woman in grey, seated in the draught, and he bows to her the way a man bows to a sovereign's creditor, and he says, in front of all of them, "Senhora, forgive me. I did not know you were in England." If you have ever been made small at a table by people who had no idea what you were, then stay with me tonight. Because this is the story of the 6 months that followed, and it is not a story about a broken heart. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and if you want to see a room full of people rearrange their entire understanding of a woman in the space of one bow, subscribe. Because the Duke of Ashmere is about to learn what he actually married, and he is going to learn it in public, and it is going to cost him everything except his title. But to understand that dinner we have to go back 4 years to a house in Oporto with a green door and a marriage that was arranged in a counting house and not in a church. Isabel Wren was 23 when she came to England. Her father, Thomas Wren, had gone out to Portugal at 19 and built, over 31 years, one of the 4 English wine houses on the Douro. And he had done it with one daughter, no sons, and an unfashionable conviction that a girl who could read could learn a ledger. She learned Portuguese before she learned to dance. She could taste a cask at 14. At 17, she was writing her father's correspondence in 3 languages, and at 19, in the year the French came over the mountains, she was the one who stayed behind in the Oporto counting house for 11 days while her father got the workers' families down the river, and she burned the papers that would have hanged 4 men and hid 9 others in a wine vat. And among the people who went down the river in the Wren boats that week was the family of a young Portuguese nobleman named Rafael de Sousa, including his mother and his 2 sisters. Nobody wrote any of that down. Nobody ever does. Thomas Wren died in the winter of 1815 with a great deal of stock, a great deal of goodwill, and, because of 11 years of war, almost no money at all. What he left his daughter was £90,000 of wine lying in Portugal that could not be moved and sold for 2 years, and a name that every merchant house from Lisbon to Liverpool trusted absolutely. And so the arrangement was made, in the way such arrangements are made, by 2 solicitors in a room. The Duke of Ashmere was 34, handsome, agreeable, entirely incurious, and the 3rd generation of his family to spend more than the estate produced. What he needed was capital immediately. What she had was capital in 2 years, and a settlement of 40,000 from her mother's side that was hers absolutely and could not be touched. What she wanted, and she was clear-eyed enough to name it to herself even then, was a place in a country where a woman of trade could not otherwise stand. and a house of her own, and children. They were married in April. He was polite to her at breakfast. He was absent by supper. And within a year she had learned the first rule of that house, which was that nothing she said about money was ever heard, because it had come from her mouth. It is worth being exact about what she did in those 4 years, because the whole of what follows rests on it. In the first year she read every account book at Ashmere back to 1798, and found that the estate was losing 900 a year on a timber contract that had been renewed unread since the old Duke's time. She told her husband. He said that Sedley managed all that. In the second year she paid off, out of her own separate income and without telling anyone, the arrears of the 11 cottages on the Ashmere home farm. Because she had gone into one of them in February and found a woman of 60 sitting in the cold with a wet wall behind her, and she then had the walls done and the roofs, and she did it through the housekeeper so that it would not be a matter for discussion. In the third year the Douro stock came free at last, and she sold it, and she did not put the money into her husband's estate, and this was the single decision that saved her life. She put it into her own house, quietly, under the name of her father's firm, Wren and Company, with a manager in Oporto and a correspondent in London, and she ran it herself out of a writing desk in a morning room in Grosvenor Square, in her own hand, 4 mornings a week for 3 years, while the world assumed she was answering invitations. By the 4th year, Wren and Company was carrying wine for 2 of the great London houses, insuring its own bottoms at Lloyd's, and holding paper in Lisbon that the Portuguese treasury itself was glad of, because after a war a government will take money from anyone who will lend it and will remember, for a while, exactly who did. And in England she was, socially, nothing at all. She was thought dull. She had an accent in her vowels that Lady Vanessa Crale could imitate to perfection at a supper table, and frequently did. She did not ride. She did not play. She had a way of listening to a conversation for a long time before speaking that fashionable people read as stupidity, because fashionable people have never in their lives had to wait for information. The Dowager Duchess of Ashmere, Julian's mother, a hard, correct, disappointed woman of 68, had disliked the marriage from the first hour and had never troubled to conceal it, and had said in Isabel's hearing at Isabel's own table that one could not expect the daughter of a wine merchant to understand what the name meant. Isabel had passed her the salt. She did not defend herself. She did not explain. She learned not to offer her opinion, and she learned it thoroughly. And it looked, from the outside, exactly like meekness, and it was not. It was the silence of a woman who had been in a counting house in Oporto with the French 3 days away, and had discovered at 19 that she was calm in the way that some people are tall. Lady Vanessa Crale came into their lives properly in the autumn of the 3rd year. She was 30, a widow, beautiful in a way that photographed badly and dazzled in candlelight, with 4,000 a year and debts of 9, and she had made a study of the Duke of Ashmere the way another woman might make a study of the piano. She did not want him. She said so herself, in a sentence that would be repeated in London for a decade, to her friend Mrs. Folk in a carriage on the way home from the opera, I want him for the having, not the keeping. What she wanted was a house in Grosvenor Square, a box, a place at the head of a table, and the extinguishing of the woman who currently held them. The Duke did not seduce her and was not seduced. That is the accurate and unflattering truth of it. He simply let it happen, as he let the timber contract happen and the arrears happen and the mortgage happen, because he was a man to whom things occurred rather than a man who did them. And Vanessa Crowley had the great advantage over his wife of never once in her life having told him anything he did not wish to hear. By Christmas, he was at her house 4 evenings in 7. By February, the servants at Grosvenor Square had a name for the scent that came in on his coat. And in March, Isabel opened the small strong box in her dressing room to find a garnet cross that had been her mother's, and it was not there. And it was not there, because it was, at that moment, at the throat of Lady Vanessa Crale in a box at the King's Theatre, where 300 people saw it, and 11 of them knew exactly whose it was. She did not go to him about the cross. This is the first thing that people find hard to credit, and it is the hinge of the entire story, so it should be said plainly. She did not go to him, and she did not weep, and she did not have the scene that everybody in that house was braced for. She sat down at the writing desk in the morning room, and she wrote in her own small clear hand on a fresh sheet the date, and the words garnet cross, gold chain, my mother's, taken from the strong box between the 9th and the 14th, and she blotted it, and she put it in the bottom drawer, and then she went down and ordered the carriage and paid 3 calls and was, everyone agreed afterward, perfectly ordinary all afternoon. That sheet became a file. The file became the case. Over the next 11 months she wrote down everything, without heat, without adjective, the way she had been taught to write a cargo manifest at 15. She noted the dates on which he did not come home. She noted the emeralds which went in May, and which were not hers but the family's, and which mattered for a different reason. She noted the £400 drawn on the estate account in June against no invoice, and the £600 in July and the £1,100 in September, and she noted that all 3 were countersigned by Mr. Aloysius Sedley, the family's solicitor and agent for 22 years, a soft-voiced, careful man with an office in Lincoln's Inn and a habit of calling her Your Grace twice in every sentence. She noted that the Ashmere timber contract had been renewed again, unread, and that the counterparty had changed hands and was now a company of which she could find no directors. She noted that her husband had begun in October to ask her at breakfast, in a light manner, whether her father's business had ever considered taking a partner. She noted that she had said no, and that he had asked again in November and again in the first week of December, and that the 3rd time he had not been light about it at all. And on the 14th of December, at 4:30 in the afternoon, standing in the passage outside the library at Grosvenor Square, with a jug of hot water in her hands, because the bell in that part of the house had been broken for a week, and she had not thought it worth mentioning, the Duchess of Ashmere heard her husband say the sentence that ended the marriage. Vanessa had asked him what he meant to do about his wife. He had laughed in the easy way of a man discussing an arrangement that suits him, and said, "Isabel? Isabel is loyal, and she is dull, and she suspects nothing. She will sit in the country and answer letters and be perfectly content. And in 2 years' time Sedley says the settlement can be got at, and then we shall see." And Vanessa had said, "And if she objects?" And the Duke of Ashmere had said, "She has never objected to anything in 4 years. She has not the character for it. She did not move, she did not gasp, She did not set down the jug, which was heavy, and which she carried the length of the passage and up the back stairs and into her own room, and set on the washstand, and stood beside for a considerable time. Then she went to the desk and wrote the date, and the words, in quotation marks, exactly as spoken. She had believed, until that afternoon, that she was married to a weak man who was behaving badly. She understood now that she was married to a weak man who was being managed by a clever one, and that the clever one had put a date on her money. This was no longer a matter of a mistress. This was theft with a timetable. 3 things followed in the next 9 days, and they are worth taking in order, because they are the reason the story does not end here with a wronged woman crying in a bedroom. The first is that she wrote to a Porto, in Portuguese, in cipher, to her father's old chief clerk, instructing that no instrument bearing her signature was to be honoured by the house without a counter-signature from him personally, and that this was to take effect immediately and be told to nobody. The second is that she went the next morning to the bank in her own person for the first time in her life and asked for the manager, and asked him a question about the pledging of a married woman's separate settlement, and listened to the answer for 11 minutes without interrupting, and then asked one further question that made him stop and reach for a pen and say, "Your Grace, may I ask who has been advising you?" And she said, "No one." And the third is that on the 23rd of December, in the housekeeper's room, Mrs. Bray, who had been at Ashmere 31 years, and had buried a husband and 2 sons, and had no fear left in her at all, put a locked tin box on the table between them and said, "I have kept every one of his letters to her that came into this house by mistake, and there are 9, and I want to know what your Grace wishes done with them." She said, "Nothing yet. Keep them dry, and tell no one they exist, including me, if anybody asks you." Mrs. Bray said that she would, and then said, in the flat way of a woman who had been waiting 4 years for permission to speak, "He is not a wicked man, your Grace. He is a man who lets things happen to him. That is worse in a husband, if you want my opinion, because you cannot get hold of it to fight it." It was the truest sentence anybody said in that house in 4 years. The winter of that year was the making of her, and she made it out of very unglamorous material, paper, time, and other people's low expectations. She did 4 things at once, and did them without raising her voice. She began, in January, to spend 2 mornings a week, not at the writing desk in Grosvenor Square, but at a set of rooms in Mincing Lane, which Wren and Company had taken in the autumn, and where the clerks called her Madam, and had no idea whatever that she was a Duchess, and where the entire concern of the house was wine, freight, and marine insurance. She engaged a solicitor of her own, a Scot named Kilgore, who had never had a duchess for a client, and treated her precisely as he would have treated a shipowner, which is to say, he told her twice in the first interview that she was wrong about something, and she engaged him permanently on the strength of it. She wrote, for the first time in 8 years, to Dom Raphael de Sousa, Conde de Vimero, who was by then his country's minister in Vienna and was shortly to be sent to London, and she did not ask him for anything. She wrote to congratulate him on his appointment, and to tell him that her father's house would be glad to be of service to his mission, and she signed it Wren, as she signed everything in business, and she did not mention that she was the Duchess of Ashmere, because it had never been of the smallest use to her. And in February, At the underwriting room at Lloyd's, over a cargo of port that had been damaged off Finisterre, she met Mr. Hale. He was perhaps 35, plainly dressed in a good coat that was 3 seasons old, and he was the man on the other side of the loss. He argued the claim with her for 40 minutes, conceded 2 points that a lesser man would have held, won one that she had thought unwinnable, and then, when it was settled, said, "Mrs. Wren, may I ask where you learnt the trade?" And she said, "Oporto, my father." And he said, "Then you were there in 1809. And she said that she had been. He did not ask her anything else about it. That was the beginning of it, and there was nothing romantic in the beginning at all. There was only the very great relief of being spoken to as an equal by a man who wanted nothing from her over the course of a spring at a series of meetings that were entirely about money. He was, so far as anybody in Mincing Lane knew, a partner in a firm that placed marine risks. He walked to his office. He carried his own papers. He once helped a clerk of hers carry a case of samples across the street in the rain, and she watched him do it from a window and thought nothing of it except that it was decent. There is a thing that happens in a counting house that does not happen in a drawing room, and it is the reason she began to sleep again that spring. In Mincing Lane, nobody cared who her husband was. A cargo was either insured or it was not. A bill was either good or it was not. When she was right, 4 men wrote it down and acted on it within the hour, and when she was wrong, a clerk of 26 said so to her face and was thanked for it, and the whole transaction took 11 seconds and cost nobody anything. She had forgotten that this was how the world worked, because she had spent 4 years in a house where the correctness of a statement was decided by who had made it. She began to keep 2 lives in 2 ledgers and to find that only one of them had any entries in it. And the clerks, who saw her 4 mornings a week in a plain coat and had been told nothing, formed their own opinion of her, which was that Madam knew the business better than the partners and had a shocking temper about short weight, and they would every one of them go into a witness box for her within the year. Meanwhile, the Duke's affairs went on their way, and their way was downhill, and he did not notice, because Sedley told him not to. In March, Sedley proposed the thing he had been building toward for 2 years, that the Ashmere estate could be relieved entirely, and immediately, if her Grace could be brought to charge her separate settlement as security for a loan from a company in the city, which Sedley would be happy to arrange, and which would cost the family nothing at all beyond her signature. The Duke, to be fair to him, and it is nearly the last thing that can be said to be fair to him, hesitated for 4 days. Then he went to Vanessa Crale's house in Half Moon Street and told her about it, and she said that of course a wife's fortune was the husband's in everything but the paperwork, and that no one thought otherwise, and that it was a great pity men were made to beg for what was theirs. He came home and asked his wife directly, in the library, on the 29th of March. She asked him to have Mr. Sedley put the whole proposal in writing, with the name of the lending company, the rate, the term, and the security, and send it to her. He said that was hardly necessary between husband and wife. She said that it was entirely necessary, and that she would consider nothing that was not in writing, and that she was surprised he should ask her to. And he lost his temper, for the only time in the whole of their marriage, and said the sentence that she wrote down that night, in quotation marks, with the date, "You are a merchant's daughter and you think in pennies, and by God I will be master in my own house." Sedley never sent the letter, What Sedley did instead on the 11th of April was execute a deed. It was a very good deed. It charged the separate settlement of Isabel, Duchess of Ashmere, in the sum of £38,000 in favour of the Adelphi Mercantile Company, of which Aloysius Sedley was the beneficial owner of 11 of the 12 shares and his brother-in-law of the 12th, and it bore her signature, witnessed by 2 clerks, and the signature was extremely like hers because he had been receiving letters in her hand for 4 years and had kept every one. He did not tell the Duke. That is the detail that broke Julian Ashmere in the end, and it is worth pausing on. The man who had spent 4 years telling him that his wife was an obstacle had, at the decisive moment, cut him out entirely. Because the Duke was not a partner in the fraud, but the instrument of it. And instruments are not consulted. The money went out of the Adelphi to the Ashmere estate in 3 payments, and came back out of the Ashmere estate to the Adelphi in fees, commissions, and the purchase of that timber contract at 4 times its worth. And by midsummer the position was this: the estate was no better off. £38,000 of the Duchess's separate property stood pledged against a debt she had never contracted, and the Duke of Ashmere was 7 months away from a demand he could not meet, on a security that was not his, arranged by a man he trusted absolutely. She found out on the 2nd of May, and she found out because of the 11 minutes she had spent listening to a bank manager in December. She had asked him then to have the registry searched quarterly for any instrument charging her settlement, and to write to her personally if any appeared, and he had thought it an eccentric request from a woman who did not understand her own affairs, and had agreed to it because she was a duchess. His letter reached her at breakfast. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her pocket and finished her chocolate and asked whether the carriage might be brought round at 11. She did not scream. She did not weep. She did not confront her husband. Then or for 6 months, and this is the part of the story that people either understand immediately or never understand at all, she had, at that moment, absolute certainty, no proof, and 1 chance, and a woman with 1 chance does not spend it on the satisfaction of a scene in a hallway. She spent that summer building the case, and she built it the way a house is built, 1 delivery at a time. Kilgore obtained a certified copy of the deed and a specimen of the signature. A handwriting examiner from Chancery Lane compared it with 11 of her genuine letters and gave an opinion in writing that the questioned signature was a tracing, and identified the very letter it had been traced from, which was a note she had written to Sedley in 1817 about a leaking roof. A clerk named Percy, who had witnessed the deed and had been dismissed from the Adelphi in June for asking about a different matter altogether, was found by Kilgore in Southwark and made a statement. And the statement was sworn, and Percy was quietly put on the books of I. Wren and Company at £90 a year, which is the only bribe in this story, and which Kilgore insisted on calling a wage. The bank produced duplicates of the 3 payments in and the 3 payments out. Mrs. Bray's tin box produced 9 letters in Vanessa Crale's hand, 2 of which mentioned Sedley by name, and 1 of which contained the sentence that would be read aloud in a courtroom in the following year, to a silence you could have carried in a bucket. Aloysius says the thing is done, and the woman knows nothing. And you may be easy at last, my dear, though I do think you might have got it done a 12-month ago and saved us both a great deal of dullness. And in August, the Dowager Duchess of Ashmere came to town, and asked her daughter-in-law to call, and received her standing, and said, without preamble, I am told my son has pledged your fortune. I am 68 years old, and I have never in my life asked anybody's pardon. And I am not going to begin now, so I shall say instead that I was wrong about you, that I have been wrong for 4 years, and that the name my son is throwing about the town belonged to better men than him, and will belong to my grandchildren after him. What do you want of me? And Isabel said, 2 things. Your emeralds are at Half Moon Street. I want you to say so publicly once when I ask you, and I want you to accept an invitation to dinner, because the invitation had already been issued, and it had not come from her. Here is how the dinner came about, which is a thing worth setting out carefully, because the Duke of Ashmere spent the rest of his life explaining it to people and never once made it sound better than it was. In September, the Portuguese mission in London was to be received formally, and every house in town with a claim to consequence wanted the new ambassador. And the new ambassador, who had been in the country 11 days, accepted an invitation to dine in Grosvenor Square. He accepted it because of a letter he had received in Vienna the previous winter from a firm in Minching Lane, and because he had made certain inquiries when he arrived, and had learned something that he assumed, quite reasonably, that all London already knew. Nobody in London knew it. The Duke was delighted. An ambassador at his table was worth a great deal to a man in his position, and Vanessa was more delighted still, and it was Vanessa who had the idea. Over supper at Half Moon Street, in the highest spirits, laughing until she had to put down her glass. Send for the wife, have her down from the country for it, sit her at the far end in her grey gown among the diplomats, and let the whole town see, once and for all and in the most public possible way, what the Duke of Ashmere had been saddled with, and then afterward nobody would blame him for anything, ever again. The Duke laughed too. He would say later, in a room where nobody was laughing, that he had known at the time that it was a cruel thing, and had done it because it was easier to be cruel with her than to be alone with her, and that in 4 years of marriage that was the only piece of self-knowledge he had ever come by honestly. The letter that went down to Ashmere was 3 lines long, and told her that she was expected in town on the 17th for a dinner, that the ambassador of Portugal would be present, and that she was to wear something suitable. She read it standing in the hall of a house she had rebuilt the cottages of, and she went to her writing desk, and she wrote the date, and the words invited to dine, 17th, Wimereux, and she sat for a moment, looking at the 3 lines. And then she did the only thing in this entire story that she afterward admitted was done for pleasure. She laughed out loud, alone, in an empty hall, for about 4 seconds. Then she wrote to Kilgore to ask whether everything would be ready by the 16th, and to Mrs. Bray about the tin box, and to the Dowager, and to Mincing Lane, and last of all a note of 9 words to a set of rooms off Cornhill, which said only, "It is to be the 17th. Will you come?" Mr. Hale had proposed to her in July, and she had refused him. He had done it badly and honestly, standing up in the office at Minking Lane with his hat in his hand, having asked first whether he might say something not connected with the business, and he had said that he was aware she was not free, and that he had no expectation whatever, and that he intended to say it once, so that it should be said, and would never mention it again unless her circumstances altered, and that in the meantime he would be grateful to be allowed to go on arguing about freight with her. because he had never in his life enjoyed anything so much. And she had said, "Miss Hale, I am a married woman, and I am about to be in a court of law, and I have nothing to offer you but a scandal." And he had said, "Then I shall wait, and if it is a scandal I shall be in the gallery." What she did not know, and did not learn for another 5 months, was that his name was not principally Hale, that he was the second son of an earl who had made his own way in the city out of a temper that would not be kept, and had inherited nothing until his elder brother's death that spring, and that at the moment he stood in her office with his hat in his hand he had been for 11 weeks Viscount Marbury, and had not mentioned it, because he had come to know her as a woman who was tired to the bone of being valued by rank, and because, as he said afterward with some difficulty, he had wanted to be quite certain that she liked him, and not the coronet. On the 16th of September, Kilgore laid the completed case on the table at Minching Lane, the certified deed, the examiner's opinion, Percy's sworn statement, the bank duplicates, the register of the Adelphi Mercantile Company showing 11 shares in the name of Aloysius Sedley, the accounts of the timber purchase, and 9 letters in a locked tin box. He said, "Your Grace, this is enough for the Court of Chancery and probably enough for the Assizes. My advice is that we file, and that we say nothing to anyone until the writ is served." She said, "We will file on Monday." He said, "And before Monday?" And the Duchess of Ashmere said, "Before Monday I am going to dinner." She came up to town on the 17th in a hired chaise, and she came alone. And she dressed for that dinner with the care of a general choosing ground. She wore grey silk, 4 years old, entirely unfashionable, with no jewellery whatever, except a plain gold ring that had been her mother's, and when her maid asked whether she would not wear the pearls, she said that she would not, and that she wished to be the plainest woman in the room. And the maid, who had been with her 3 years, said, "Yes, Your Grace," and understood perfectly, because servants always do. She came down at 7. The rooms were full. Vanessa Cralley was at the head of the drawing-room in white and silver in the Ashmere emeralds, receiving on her behalf in her house, and there were people in that room who had been told to expect it, and people who had not. And the second sort were having a wonderful evening. The Duke crossed to his wife and kissed her hand and said that he was glad she had come, and then did not speak to her again for an hour and 40 minutes. She was taken in to dinner by a deaf general. She was seated at the far end, on the left, in the draught from the service door, between the general and a young attach, who had been briefed to be amusing and had run out of material by the fish. She ate a little of everything. She answered when spoken to. She watched the woman in her mother-in-law's emeralds tell the table twice that the poor Duchess did not go into society because she was not quite equal to it, and heard the laughter go round the near end of the table both times, and she noted that on the second occasion the Dowager Duchess of Ashmere, seated in the place of honour on the Duke's left, did not laugh, and put down her fork, and looked steadily down the table at her son with an expression that several people remarked upon afterward. And then, at 20 minutes past 9, between the second course and the game, the doors at the far end opened, and the servant announced the ambassador of His Most Faithful Majesty, the King of Portugal, and the room made the sound that rooms make, and rose the half-inch that rooms rise. Dom Rafael de Sousa, Conde de Vimero, was 51 years old, small, very dark, entirely bald, with the decoration of the tower and sword at his throat, and the manner of a man who has been in 11 governments and buried 4 of them. He came in with his secretary at his shoulder. The Duke of Ashmere came forward with both hands out, and the ambassador, without discourtesy, without even appearing to have seen him, walked past the head of the table, down the long side of it, past the emeralds, past 31 candles and 42 chairs, over 11 feet of Turkey carpet, and stopped in front of the plain woman in grey silk, in the draught by the service door. He bowed. It was not a social bow. Everybody in that room had spent their entire lives reading bows, and they read this one instantly and correctly. It was the bow of a man of the first rank to a person to whom he owes something he cannot repay. And he said, in English clearly, so that every one of the 42 heard it, Senhora, forgive me. I did not know you were in England. She rose and gave him her hand and said, Excellency. He held it. He said, You did not write that you were coming to town. And she said, I was sent for. Somewhere at the top of the table a fork went down on a plate. The ambassador looked at her for a moment. Then he turned, still holding her hand, and addressed the room in general, and the Duke in particular, in the tone of a man making the ordinary remarks required at the beginning of a dinner, which is what made it unbearable. Your Grace will forgive me, he said. I am in your house, and I am rude in it, and I will explain myself. In the summer of 1809, the French crossed the Douro. My mother, who is 81 and living, and my 2 sisters, who are married and have between them 9 children, were got out of Oporto in a boat belonging to the House of Wren with 64 other people by a girl of 19 who stayed 11 days behind in a counting house to burn papers that would have hanged my cousin. Her name was Isabel Wren. I have looked for her for 14 years. In February, my government accepted a loan of £240,000 arranged in London, in part by a firm called I. Wren and Company, whose principal signs herself I. Wren, and who has never once, in 11 letters, mentioned that she is a Duchess. I did not know until this moment which house I had been invited to. He paused and looked slowly down the table, past the general, past the emeralds, to the head of it. I congratulate you, Duke, said the Conde de Vimero. You are married to the most considerable woman in this room, and I perceive that nobody here has told you. There is a particular sound that 40 people make when they are all silently performing the same arithmetic at the same time. And it is not silence, it is a kind of low creak of chairs and silk, as everybody in a room turns very slightly toward the same place. The Duke of Ashmere stood at the head of his own table, with his hand still half out from the greeting he had not been permitted to give. He said, "Aye, of course. Of course." And Vanessa Crawley, who had spent 9 years cultivating an instinct for exactly this moment, and had it fail her for the first time, laughed lightly and said, "How romantic." Though I am sure her Grace's people were only doing what any merchant would do for a paying passenger. It was, everyone agreed afterward, the single worst sentence spoken in London that season. The ambassador looked at her the way a man looks at a chair that has been put in his way. He said, "Madam, they were not paying passengers. There was no money. There was a girl of 19 and a boat." And then the Dowager Duchess of Ashmere rose from her seat at her son's left hand, which a woman of 68 does slowly, so that it takes some time and everybody has to watch, and she said, in the carrying voice of a woman who had been presented to 2 kings, since we are speaking of what is owed and to whom, Lady Vanessa is wearing my emeralds. They are not hers, and they are not my son's to give, and they were taken out of my daughter-in-law's house. I should be glad to have them back tonight." She sat down. Nobody at that table ever forgot the next 90 seconds. Vanessa Crale's hands went to her throat and stopped, because there is no dignified way to take a necklace off in front of 42 people, and no dignified way to keep it on either. She looked at the Duke. And the Duke of Ashmere, who had spent 4 years letting things happen, discovered that a man who has never once in his life stood up for anybody has nothing whatever in reserve for the moment when he needs to. And he said nothing at all. He simply stood there. That was his answer, and it was heard by everybody, and it was the end of him socially in that town, and it took perhaps 4 seconds. The Duchess of Ashmere put her napkin on the table. She said to the ambassador, quietly, that she thanked him, and that she hoped he would call at Minking Lane on Monday because there was a question about the Lisbon paper that she would rather put to him directly. She said to the Dowager that she was obliged to her. She said nothing to Vanessa Crale, then or ever again in her life. Then she walked the length of that room, past all of them, and at the head of the table she stopped in front of her husband, and she said the only words she spoke to him that night, and she said them without cruelty, as facts laid down like stones. "You told her I was loyal and dull and suspected nothing. I have the date. I have very nearly everything, Julian. You will hear from Mr. Kilgore on Monday morning, and I would advise you to be sober when you read it." And she went out and got into a hired chaise and went to a house in Mincing Lane where the fires were lit and a supper was waiting, because she had ordered it before she left. The writ was served at 11 o'clock on Monday. The case of Renvie Sedley and the Adelphi Mercantile Company was in Chancery within the month and at the assizes in the spring, and it went exactly as Kilgore had said it would go. Because a tracing is a tracing, and 11 shares in a man's own name are 11 shares in a man's own name. Aloysius Sedley was convicted of forgery and uttering, and the judge, in passing sentence, used the phrase "a patient and educated wickedness," and he was transported for 14 years and died at sea in the 3rd. The Adelphi was wound up. The timber contract was set aside. The £38,000 was restored to the settlement entire, with costs. And the costs were paid by the estate of Ashmere, because the court found that the Duke had not been party to the forgery, but had been supine to a degree the law will not indemnify, which is a form of words that got into 2 newspapers and stayed attached to his name for the rest of his life. The 9 letters were read in open court on the 2nd day. Lady Vanessa Crale, who had not been charged with anything and could not have been, was in the gallery for the first morning and not for the 2nd, and left England in June for Boulogne, where she lived for 11 years on 4,000 a year among people who did not know the story, and where she was, by every account, extremely dull, which is the only revenge in this story that Isabel Wren neither planned nor asked for. He came to Minking Lane in November after the Chancery judgment and before the assizes, and he came on foot, and he waited 20 minutes in an outer office among clerks who did not know who he was, which was the first honest 20 minutes of his adult life. She saw him at 11. She did not offer him a chair immediately, and he did not sit until she did. He had aged. He had the look of a man who has recently been obliged to read a full account of himself and has found it accurate. He said, "I have not come to ask you to come back." She said, "That is wise." He said, "I have come because Kilgore tells me you will not take a farthing of damages from the estate beyond your costs, and I wanted to know why." Then she said, "Because I do not want anything of yours. If I take money from you, then for the rest of my life somebody will be able to say that I did this for money, and my daughter will hear it said." That was the first he had heard of a daughter, and he understood it perfectly, because there was no daughter, and there was not going to be one, and what she meant was that there might have been. And it took him some time to be able to speak again. And then Julian Ashmere said the plainest thing he ever said, and he said it standing, without excuse, in the manner that the whole of the rest of his life was built on. I want to say it once and correctly, and then I will go. I did not know about the deed. That is true, and it is the only true thing on my side, and it does not help me, because Sedley did not need to tell me. He had had 4 years to learn that I would never look at anything, and he was right, and a man who cannot be bothered to read is not innocent, he is only useless. I let a woman take my mother's emeralds out of your box, and I said nothing. I called you dull in my own library to a woman who was laughing at us both. I asked you 3 times for your fortune, and I did it lightly, so that I need never see myself asking. And when I wanted an evening's entertainment for her, I sent for my wife from the country and sat her in a draught. There is no part of that I did not know was contemptible at the time. I did it because it was easier than sitting alone in a room with somebody who was better than me. And I would like you to understand that I always knew you were, from about the 2nd year, and that is precisely why I did it. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Thank you. That is accurate." He said, "Is there anything at all that can be done?" And the Duchess of Ashmere said the sentence that the servants at Grosvenor Square repeated to each other for 20 years, and that Mrs. Bray had on a paper in her Bible when she died. I forgive you, Julian. I want you to hear that and to believe it, because I do not want to carry you about with me for the rest of my life. But forgiveness is not the same as return. You will not be punished by me, and you will not be married to me. Those are 2 different things, and you may have the first one. He nodded. He asked whether she would divorce him. She said that she would not, because a divorce required an Act of Parliament and a great deal of filth in the newspapers, and she had a business to run and no wish to be a public entertainment twice. That they would live apart, formally, by deed, with terms in writing, and that the terms were these: she would keep her own name in her own house and her own affairs entirely, and he would sign whatever was necessary to make that unassailable. He would never again pledge, mention, or approach her property. He would live at Ashmere and not in town. The 11 cottages on the home farm would be maintained to the standard she had set, and she would inspect them, and if they fell below it she would say so once, and then never again, and he could draw his own conclusions about what would follow. He would receive nothing from her, and she would receive nothing from him, and they would be, in public, on such occasions as could not be avoided, perfectly civil, because she had been made a spectacle once, and did not intend to be made one a second time in the opposite direction. He signed all of it in December without altering a word. He kept every clause of it for 29 years. He lived at Ashmere and farmed it himself badly for 3 years, and then decently for 26, and he read the accounts every quarter personally in his own hand, and the estate came round slowly the way estates do when somebody at last looks at them. He never married again, which he could not have done in any case, and he never again lived in London. The cottages were kept. She inspected them twice, once in 1824 and once in 1831, and both times said nothing at all, which he told his agent was the most gratifying silence in England. As for the rest of it, I, Wren and Company, took a second set of rooms in 1825 and a third in 1830, and carried wine and insured hulls, and held Portuguese paper through 2 changes of government and 1 civil war, and never in 40 years failed on a single obligation, which in the city is the only reputation worth anything. The Conde de Vimero remained in London 11 years, and dined at her table plainly at 8 o'clock 100 times, and it was said of those dinners that they were the only house in London where the wine was better than the conversation, and the conversation was very good indeed. Percy the clerk rose to be head of the counting-house, and had a house in Camberwell and 4 children, of whom the eldest was called Isabel. Mrs. Bray retired in 1829 on a pension of £40 a year, and lived to be 88, and never once in all that time told the story to anybody who had not earned it. The Dowager Duchess of Ashmere lived 9 more years, and spent Christmas of every one of them at Minking Lane, and not at Ashmere. And when she died, her emeralds went, by a will that caused a certain amount of comment, to her daughter-in-law absolutely, with a note attached in her own hand that said only, "You will know what to do with them." I never did. And in the spring, after the assizes, a man came to the office off Cornhill with his hat in his hand, and asked whether her circumstances had altered. And she said that they had not, and would not, that she was married and separate, and would remain so while Julian Ashmery lived, and that she would not have him waiting on another man's death like a crow on a fence. And Viscount Marbury, who had by then told her his name and had been forgiven for it, said that he had no intention of waiting on anything, that he proposed to go on arguing with her about freight twice a week for as long as she would have him, and that if that was all there was ever to be, it was still, by a considerable margin, the best offer he had received in his life. They had 22 years of it. 2 mornings a week became 4, the arguments about freight became arguments about everything. He took the rooms above hers in 1833, and there was a certain amount of talk in the city about it for about 6 months, after which the city, which is more practical than Mayfair and always has been, decided that whatever it was clearly working, and went back to its business. Julian, Duke of Ashmere, died in 1852 of a chill taken while walking his own fields in February. He left a will of 4 sentences, of which the third read, "To my wife Isabel, Duchess of Ashmere, I leave nothing, at her express and repeated instruction, and I ask her pardon for the whole of it a second time in this public place, since I was never able to ask it anywhere else." She read that in a newspaper in her office in Mincing Lane at 60:1, and put it down, and looked out of the window at the street for some while, and then rang for the ledgers. She married Marbury 11 months later in a parish church with 9 people present, and she signed the register I. Wren, as she had signed everything since she was 19, and she was, for the last 21 years of her life, extremely happy, in a way that she described to her stepdaughter as quiet and entirely on my own terms, and nobody's joke. And in the drawer of the writing desk that went with her from Grosvenor Square to Minking Lane to a house in Highgate with a view over the whole of London, there was, until the day she died, a bundle of paper tied with tape. It was not the deed, and it was not the judgment, and it was not the 9 letters, all of which went to Kilgore's successors in a box and were burned by her instruction in 1861. It was a single sheet, dated the 14th of December, in a small clear hand, with one sentence on it in quotation marks. Isabel is loyal, and she is dull, and she suspects nothing. Her stepdaughter found it and asked her, at 80, why on earth she had kept it. And she said, because he was right about 2 of the 3, and I have never minded being called loyal. So here is what I want you to take from this one. The Duke of Ashmery never did a cruel thing in his life on purpose. He was not a villain, he was a man who let things happen. And letting things happen is how the emeralds leave the box, and how a clever man gets 4 years alone with your name, and how a woman ends up sitting in a draught at her own table as the evening's entertainment. He did not lose her at that dinner. He lost her in the 2nd year. Every time he did not listen, and the dinner was only the night the rest of the world found out. And she did not win, because she was avenged. She won because when she was 19 and the French were 3 days from the river, she had learned that she was calm, and because for 11 months afterward she wrote everything down and told nobody, and because when the moment came she acted once, completely, and never had to act again. If you are in the middle of the 11 months right now, and nobody has noticed you yet, and it feels like nothing is happening, write it down. Keep the ledger. And when the doors open at the far end of the room, be the one who is ready.